Beautiful. Well, let's get started, everybody. Namaste. I'm in my beautiful Costa Rican home at Blue Osa Yoga Retreat in Costa Rica right now. The last couple of months I've been traveling, and it's really nice to be able to present from Costa Rica, from one of the most beautiful places I know of. So let's just take a moment to kind of ground in, and then we'll begin the webinar. So just take a moment to close your eyes and take a couple of deep breaths in and deep breaths out. Today we've been blessed here with a little bit of rain today, and you might even hear a little bit of it in the background as I'm talking. The rain reminds us to open our ears and just listen. To just take in the sounds of nature, sounds of life. To take in sounds without adding our own sort of monologue to what we're experiencing, but just to absorb without thought or judgment. To practice being witnesses to life. What helps us to maintain that witness awareness is the breath. Coming back again and again. Feeling the breath filling you up. Experiencing the emptiness once it leaves. The Yoga Sutras say that often the mind lies dormant until its old friend, the breath, wakes it up. And once the breath or the mind is reunited with its old friend, the breath, the mind becomes at peace. It starts to eternally flow inward peacefully. Just for this moment, become aware of those two dualities, that you are the observer listening to sound without thought or without judgment. But also be aware that you are watching your breath. Intentionally filling up and then returning to emptiness. Very good. Take a deep breath in and out. And namaste, everybody. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here today. It's a delight to see you. If this is one of your first times joining me in one of these sessions, I'm going to talk for a little bit, and then we'll open up the floor for some questions and answers. Part of my intention in holding these monthlies is to give people an opportunity to ask any kind of questions. It can be about the topic, obviously, but it can also be about anything yoga. If you have any kind of questions, please feel free to jump in and ask them at the end. That's what I'm here for, to be of service. Before we get started, I wanted to make a quick announcement and just let you know that I just received my author's edition of Stop Stretching, How to Live or How to Master Your Body to Live a Pain-Free Life. And it's just a great book. I'm so proud of it. I had this artist do these drawings for me. And so it's all original artwork in here. There's original sequences, nothing like you've ever seen before in the yoga world. So this is going to be coming out and we're going to be releasing it on October 21st. And October 20th, we're going to be having our virtual launch party. So please watch out for that and join me for our virtual launch party. It's going to be very exciting and I just can't wait. I'm like over the moon ecstatic about this book. Never in my life did I ever think I would write something so collegiate. But for today's topic is the #1 yoga pose you should not do. So today is going to invoke, thank you, Nancy. Today we're going to do a little bit of recap on AYAMA, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the #1 yoga pose to avoid. Each month we're kind of basing these webinars on the podcast that's just been released. So of course, a couple of weeks ago, we released the podcast, the #1 yoga pose you should avoid. So I'm not sure how many have listened to it. If you haven't listened to this podcast series, please do. If you haven't, it's unlike anything you've ever heard before in your life, in the yoga world, that is. So a little bit of recap on AYAMA. So what I'm doing and what the book is based on is this idea of applied yoga anatomy and muscle activation. And applied yoga anatomy, the applied part is just what it means. It's learning about anatomy, but how to make anatomy more functional for you. And then the last part, the MA, the muscle activation, is basically learning how to take certain muscle activations and bringing it into our yoga practice. It's a very different paradigm than what you're used to for a few reasons. One of them is because the first axiom is to stop stretching. Second one is to start activating. We look at yoga postures very differently. We're no longer looking at yoga postures in terms of what needs to be stretched, but looking at yoga postures in terms of what actually needs to be activated. And so it's flipping the script. And what that means is, like, if you're coming into a forward fold, for example, if you're coming into Uttanasana, which is a standing forward fold. Now, if you're in the gym one day and you happen to be walking by and you see, a really muscly kind of guy, with their trainer, and the trainer is telling that guy, like, bend over and touch your toes. And let's just call this guy Biff, because I usually call him Biff. And so you see Biff trying to touch his toes and he can't. And so probably in your mind, you're probably thinking, oh, Biff has got tight hamstrings. Biff has got a tight back. But from an AYAMA perspective, from an applied yoga anatomy and muscle activation perspective, what we actually want to start looking at is, oh, Biff's got a core or got abdominal muscles that are not contracting properly. Biff has got quads that are not contracting properly. Once we start to improve the contractibility of those front muscles, guess what? Range of motion improves a lot. I had a woman in my teacher training in April when we were putting together the podcast, and we interviewed her on one of the first days that she came to Blue Osa. And her name is Mary. And Mary, in the podcast, and you can actually hear it in the podcast and in the interview, and I was listening to it one morning, and she was talking about how she does yoga, And Mary's like about a 58-year-old woman, I believe. And she was making the comment, like, I just want to touch my toes. I'm doing yoga because I want to touch my toes. I think a lot of us can relate to that, right? So, so anyways, it was a funny story because I got up into the studio that morning, and the very first thing I said, Mary, I just heard that you want to touch your toes. So I got her up on the table, and we did a few of the muscle activations that I teach in my book and in various places. And so when we first tested her, she was about this far. She was about 12 inches from her toes. So she kind of reached forward in an active way and tried to touch her toes, and she was about 12 inches away. Once we finished the muscle activation, she actually was this far away from her toes when we activated her abdominals. We went back and actually went back in to activate her quads, and she actually got this far past her abdominals. I'm sorry, past her toes. So we can increase range of motion tremendously once we start to improve muscle function. And that's what this is really all about, is getting the body to start working in a better way. Why do muscles not work properly? What is going on with these muscles? What is the problem? Well, the problem lies in the communication system between the brain and the muscles. And we're going to do a little bit of a demonstration afterwards, because when we talk about the #1 yoga pose to avoid, I actually want to prove it to you guys and show you what happens when you, and give you a real experience of what happens when we stretch versus when a muscle is activated. So what we're looking to do is to improve the communication system between the brain and the muscles. You can imagine that there's like a phone line between the brain and your muscles. And what that phone line is basically getting information of when the muscle needs to contract, sends a message to a brain, and the brain sends a message back to the muscle saying, contract, contract, contract. Now, this happens in a split second. It's not something that should take a long time to do. So when we're doing testing on people, and which I've done a lot of, one of the things that you do is you get a person to come into a completely relaxed state, and then you say, okay, hold this muscle, and you apply a little bit of external force, just a little bit. And if the muscle is weak, it's not going to be able to hold. But it's not necessarily that the muscle is weak. It's that the communication system between the brain and the muscle is not working properly. And when that's not working properly, the brain also gets another message that there's a lack of instability. Sorry, there's a lack of stability, and it senses instability. When the brain senses instability, it sends out messages to all the other muscles, contract, contract, contract. And an example of that is like when you're walking on ice. If you think about like the first kind of cold, part of fall, and that first kind of frost in fall, and you step out your door and you kind of feel like a little uneasy. You feel a little unstable at that moment. And what happens is your body senses instability, your brain senses instability more particularly, and so your body like tightens up. When the body senses instability, a protective mechanism by the body or by the brain is to send a message and say, contract, contract, contract. I remember many years ago, I broke my leg, and I went in and I had a surgery to repair it, and they stuck a titanium rod down my femur bone. But afterwards, everything was just so tight. I remember trying to stand up. Remember trying to move the leg. Everything was so tight. That hamstring on that leg was like a rock. And that is because the body senses instability. It doesn't feel safe, and it tells everything to tighten up. And that, that muscle tightness is the reason why the brain is not connecting to those muscles very well is because the communication system in the body, that phone line between the brain and the muscles, sometimes becomes a little tattered. It's like, sometimes you see the phone cables and it's like, some animal chewed through it, or the elements kind of tore it away. And that's what happens to our own internal communication system. Our own internal communication system, the neuromuscular system, sometimes gets worn down. It just gets worn down. Well, what causes this system to get worn down? Well, the causes it to get worn down is stress, trauma, and overuse. And so a lot of times we're overusing our body. You see this a lot, especially with fitness trainers or gymnasts, or people, even runners. Runners overuse their body tremendously, especially marathon runners. One of the things that often marathon runners joke about is having like a flat ass. They call it the runner's butt. And because the glutes aren't actually working, somehow they've bypassed their glutes and they're using more of their legs, which, by the way, is not a good thing. They should be using their glutes. And the fact that they're not using their glutes opens up a kettle of a whole bunch of other problems. So this stress and trauma and overuse is depleting the neuromuscular system, the communication system between the brain and the muscles. A few years ago, about 4 years ago, more or less, I ended up in the hospital, and the doctor was telling me if some things don't change, I might need a spinal fusion. And the problem was something that just kept exacerbating and getting worse and worse. One of the problems was that it kept stretching, and that stretching kept inhibiting that connection between the brain and the muscle. And the second thing that kept exacerbating the problem was down in my L4 and L5, I had a slight herniation, which was pressing on some nerves, and that was creating an inflammatory response. So stress in the body, any kind of stress, is always going to create some inflammation. And that's something that we want to address, is how do we get rid of that inflammation? So there's a few ways that we do that. One of them is some of the yogic techniques of breathing and relaxation. And one of the other ways is to start activating our muscles, start reconnecting the muscles that should be working with the brain. We were talking about runners a moment ago and making a joke about runners' butts. And the glutes with many runners just don't work. One of the things that you'll often find with runners is they end up dealing with shin splints. They end up dealing with knee problems, and a lot of times they end up dealing with hip pain. Well, why is that? Well, we can actually surmise that a big problem of that is because the glutes aren't doing their job, and other parts of the body, i.e. the knees and the ankles, start taking the brunt and the shock of that continuous pounding. One of the functions of the glutes is to be the shock absorbers of the body. Whenever you're moving around, they're meant to be the shocks. I live in Costa Rica, as you know, and the road from town to Blue Osa sometimes it hasn't been recently graded, and there's a few potholes that you have to go through. And can you imagine driving on a road like that without any shocks in the car, in the vehicle? And so if you don't have any shocks, you're going to get pounded and bumped around and shaken around. And that stress that you're feeling is going to start reverberating in other areas of your body. And that's what the glutes are like. The glutes are like the shock absorbers. They take the brunt, so much of the brunt. But the other interesting thing about the glutes, by the way, is that they also protect or play a pivotal role in protecting the lower back. And actually, even there's some synergistic relationship between the back muscles and the glutes, because they sort of intersect into each other. So our job in muscle activation, in what we're trying to do, is to get these muscles working again, getting all the muscles working again. How do we know if muscles are not working? One of the ways that we know that muscles are not working is because of pain. Pain is the check engine light of your body. Pain is telling you, hey, there's something going on here. Like, pay attention, pay attention, pay attention. One time when I was going out for a walk, and one of the things I love to do is walk. And I go for long walks every morning, most mornings. And one morning I went out and there was a pain in my groin, right in my groin, just right to the left of my testicles, right deep in there. And I could tell that my adductors, which are your groin muscles, your inner groin muscles, one of my adductors was really tight and kind of yelling at me. It was like the check engine light going, something's wrong, something's wrong, something's wrong. Well, one of the kind of typical old, or typical schools of thought is like, oh, I got to stretch that out to make it feel better. And from an AYAMA perspective, it's actually the wrong thing to do. What is tightness? Muscle tightness is a protective mechanism by the body. It's a signal from the brain to send out when it senses instability, tighten up, tighten up, tighten up, because we feel instability. So why would I violate my body's own protective mechanism? So what I did was I went into very quickly, because I was trying to go for my walk. I was like, what is going on here? So what we tend to do, or what we should do, is start to look at the opposite muscle. And this is something that is one of the key ideas in AYAMA, as we talked about with Stiff Biff earlier. As he was bending forward, the problem wasn't his hamstrings. The problem was that his abdominal muscles and his quads were not contracting properly. So what I did was I went, okay, what's the opposite muscle to my inner groin, my adductors? Well, the opposite muscle is therefore the abductors. So the adductors is bringing the legs together. Abductors is bringing the legs apart. One of the number one abductors is the glute medius. So I just stopped there for a moment, and I was on my left side and I held on to something, because it's better to do this exercise when you're lying down. And I just did the exercise. I kind of took my leg out to the side. It's a little bit more in depth than that, but I took my leg out to the side. I held it there for 6 seconds, and I did it 6 times. And the amazing thing was, it even amazes me sometimes, like, because I'm not used to that. I'm used to the old idea of like, I've got to stretch this out. I've got to like elongate it. Something's, not right in there. I've got to get in there, dig in there, and like open it up, whatever that means. But I got to open it up. And the moment I did that, I'm telling you, the pain went away, and I was able to go on for like my 10-kilometer walk that morning. So we're looking in AYAMA at flipping the script, first of all, around stretching, and asking herself, well, if this muscle is tight, what's the opposite muscle that needs to engage? So in the case of the hamstrings, we're looking at engaging properly the quads. If we're looking at the pecs, one of the things that you hear a lot of is like, I need to open, we yogis, we need to open our heart. Well, the heart is closed off for a reason. It's a protective mechanism by your body. So we need to start looking at what muscles are not working properly. If the heart is closing up, it's probably because the trapezius muscle is not engaging well enough to contract properly to create some stability in the shoulder girdle. Otherwise, the shoulders are going to start rolling inward and protecting the chest area. So that's a little bit about AYAMA, but one of the number one ideas around stretching, or one of the number one ideas, axioms, that we have is like to stop stretching. Well, coming back to this idea of the messaging system between the brain and the muscle, one of the things that disrupts the messaging system is stretching. When we stretch a muscle, the brain loses connection to that muscle. It just happens. And there's a few ideas around why it might happen. One of them is because stretching more often than not tends to be passive. Passive stretching is like, if you're coming forward like Mary, wanting to touch your toes, but you can't touch your toes. So you grab a strap or some sort of rope and you put it around your feet and you pull yourself forward. That's an extreme passive stretching. Another example of passive stretching is you're trying to fold forward to touch your toes, and your teacher, Yogi Aaron, comes up behind you and pushes you forward. That's passive stretching. Another way to passive movement. So when you're lying in Shavasana sometimes, and your yoga teacher comes and picks up your feet and starts to move your feet around. By the way, that's one of the worst things that you can do or have done to you, is have somebody just moving your feet around. Yes, it feels great. It feels wonderful. You're like, oh my God, this feels amazing. I can just see you guys going, yeah. I want that somebody to do that to me right now. But here's the problem. The problem is that all the muscles in the hip flexors shut down. I actually just literally 2 days ago, I have a new class in here, a new group of trainees, and I was doing this demonstration on somebody, and we got her psoas working. And so we got that psoas fired up, it was working. And then by default, the other hip flexors. And then I did that exact example. I said, okay, it's working, right? And then we did that little example. And then she could barely lift the leg up after that, after I just kind of shook it a few times. What happens is the brain loses connection to the muscles. It's no longer connected to the muscles. And one of the simplistic ideas around that is that the brain just loses connection to that muscle in space. The space is your body. So right now, theoretically, your brain knows where certain muscles are in the space of your body. As soon as you start to passively move a part of your body, the brain loses connection to that muscle. The other explanation is that you can think about inside your muscles, you have little muscle spindles, these coiled up spindles that are kind of like a slinky. Now, if you say to, a friend, say, grab one end of the slinky, and I want you to walk away as far as you can. You've just taken this slinky right out of the box. It's fresh, it's new, it's all coiled up, just like your muscle spindles. And you tell somebody, you say, take that slinky as far away as possible. You're violating the nature of that slinky, right? That slinky it's in its natural state is supposed to be coiled up. It's supposed to be tightened up. And by the way, that tightened state is also sending messages to your brain. So your brain knows where that slinky is, and when that slinky needs to contract even more, and it's got a certain amount of contractibility, it sends a message to the brain. So there's this continuous relationship between these muscle spindles and the brain. But what happens is you take that slinky, you stretch it as far as you can. What's it going to do? It's not going to coil back. And chances are with the slinky, it may never coil back. So you just ruined a new slinky out of the box. But our muscles are like that. Our muscles do not coil back very quickly. And so that's another way that the brain starts to lose this connection with the muscles. I think back to a story I was telling you guys, but when I ended up in the hospital and I had this, I needed like an injection. They injected my spine with steroids. But for many months, like about a good 6 months before that, I was stretching every day. I was doing more stretching. And the more stretching I did, the more pain I had. And the more pain I had, the more stretching I did. And when I stretched in the moment, it felt good. And there's a few ideas about why it felt good, why possibly it felt good. One of them is because it's the law of distraction. I was distracting myself from the pain. So it actually had nothing to do with the actual stretching. It had to do with the fact that I was actually kind of distracting my brain, literally, from the pain. but the cycle just kept getting worse and worse and worse. And part of the problem was I was doing all these things that, people said that you should do when you have a herniated disc. I was doing all of these forward bends, which is the exact wrong thing to do. The best thing I could have done was actually just giving it some rest and start doing some muscle activation postures. So that's a little bit about where we are. That takes us now to the number one yoga pose that you shouldn't do. The number one yoga pose, are you ready for this? Is child's pose. This is like, I am very convinced that this is actually, ironically, one of the worst poses that you can do in all of the yoga postures is child's pose. And there's a few reasons for that. When you look at child's pose, what do you see happening in the spine? You see actually happening extreme flexion. Well, as you might remember me saying a few moments ago, talking about my herniated disc, one of the reasons why discs start to herniate is because of this flexion that happens. If we look at a skeleton, if you look at any diagram of a skeleton, and you look at most people's bodies in a neutral standing state, what do you see happening at the lumbar spine? You see a nice, well, you should say, a nice C curve. The spine, the natural lumbar spine does not stick out like it does in child's pose. It actually starts to curve inward. If you really want a nice resting pose, the best resting pose that you could do is either going to be Crocodile Pose, Makrasana, when you're lying down on your stomach and you bring your forehead to your forearms. That's going to be one of the best resting poses. And it actually, just the nature of that pose is going to maintain the integrity of that C curve. One of the most interesting things as a side note about Makrasana, this crocodile pose. So again, crocodile pose when you're lying on your stomach and you rest your forearms like this, and then you rest your forehead onto your forearm. But one of the most interesting things about Makrasana, which I think is fascinating, is that during COVID, in the early days of COVID, when doctors didn't know what to do with patients who were under respiratory distress, one of the things that they found out was putting patients in a prone position was actually what ended up saving a lot of people's lives. And that's exactly what crocodile pose is. Crocodile pose, lying on your stomach in a prone position with your forehead resting onto your forearms. And one of the reasons for that is because it really starts to, get the body into a relaxed state. Think about when you're going for a massage. Every time I put my face in the face cradle, I'm like out like a light. Do some deep breathing, out like a light. And so it immediately puts your body into a really wonderful, relaxed state. But also, one of the reasons why it puts your body into a relaxed state is because it actually encourages that posture, encourages diaphragmatic breathing. It allows the expansion of the lungs really fully and deeply, much better and if you're lying on your back, and definitely much better than if you're in child's pose. The other interesting thing about Makrasana, which I said earlier, is it helps to maintain that kind of C curve of the lumbar spine. So from that perspective, it's a very neutralizing kind of posture. Where child's pose, it starts to overstretch all of these back muscles. The other thing about child's pose that you look at is it's forcing the hip flexors. So you think about your thighs and that you're resting on top of your thighs. Well, for a lot of people, this is a very uncomfortable position. I've actually heard many people complaining about it to me in yoga class, like, oh, my inner groin kind of hurts, or I feel this pinching sensation. And that's because we're forcing those muscles in the front of the body to contract. we're passively getting them to contract. And again, anytime we passively do anything, there's going to be a mind, to muscle disconnect. Okay. And then the other thing that child's pose does, as well as a few other things, but the other one is overstretching the glutes. So a lot of times when you actually read in these kind of yoga journal kind of publications, the benefits of child's pose, they say, oh, it gently stretches the back and it gently stretches the glutes. But that's actually the wrong thing that we want to do. We actually want those muscles to be more engaged. So again, a great alternative to child's pose is Makrasana, crocodile pose. So the second pose that we want to watch out for is a pose called Apanasana. Apanasana. Apanasana, or knees to chest pose. And knees to chest pose. So you're lying on your back and you bring your knees into your chest and then you hug them. Just one moment, please. So you hug those knees into your chest. That's called Apanasana. Just like child's pose, it does exactly the same thing. Now, one of the kind of terms that is out there is called dynamic stretching. I actually don't like to call it dynamic stretching because there's actually no stretching involved, but they just put the word dynamic there to make people feel better. But it's actually not stretching. It's more like a dynamic movement, which sometimes creates this kind of effect of stretching. But if you can imagine, and we're going to demonstrate this in a moment, but if you can imagine that you're lying on your back, your arms are to the sides, and you bring your knees into your chest. You just use your muscles to pull your knees in. That is actually fantastic because you're now dynamically, actively using your muscles and contracting your muscles. That's you doing that on your own. But as soon as you take your arms and wrap them around your knees, that is actually a passive movement. And that's not what we want to do. We don't want to do passive movements. We want active movements. So the act of hugging your knees into your chest is the second one. And the third pose, which isn't really one pose in particular, it's kind of a group of postures, is any kind of hip flexors. And any kind of, hip stretches, hip openers. That's what I meant to say. Any kind of hip openers is what we want to avoid. So having said that, I wanted to kind of do a little demonstration with you guys. And if you want to join me, I want to encourage you to join me and do this little test. I'm going to show you guys how to activate your hip flexors and your trunk flexors. A very simple hack. I'm going to show you a picture of it really fast, which I had here a moment ago. There it is. So I'm going to show you a picture of this really fast. So this is one of my favorite poses to do. This is a great pose. If you are in a pinch and you need to do something really fast, this little technique is just golden. Right here, you can see the knees coming into the hands. He's not pushing, or we're not pushing the knees with the hands. We're pushing the knees into the hands. The arms stay static. The arms are straight, but the knees are coming into the hands here. Okay? So just give me one moment. All right. All right. So if you want to come onto your mat, Can you guys hear me okay? Can you hear me okay? Okay. So what you're going to do is come onto your mats. I want you to do a little bit of a test first. So what you're going to do is straighten your legs. You're going to straighten your legs. And then just lift one leg up about 30 degrees and lower back down. And lift the other leg up about 30 degrees. Just 30 degrees and lower back down. And then lift both legs up. And then back down. And just notice how that felt. Notice if it was difficult, if it was easy. My hunch is it was a little difficult. And you kind of had to create a little bit of effort to do that movement. Now what I want you to do is bring the hands here. Bring your knees up, bring your hands just below your knees. And press the knees into the hands. We're going to hold that for 6 seconds. And then relax. And do it again. Press the knees into the hands. And relax. And press the knees into the hands. Relax. Press the knees into the hands. And relax. And press the knees into the hands. And relax. And press the knees into the hands. And relax. We'll just do it one more time. Do it one more time. So press the knees into the hands. And relax. Straighten the legs out. And lift your right leg up. Is there a difference? Lift your left leg up. Is there a difference? And then lift both legs up. So, did you guys notice a difference? Can you feel the difference? Yeah, because the muscle, it was like before when you did it, you kind of had to really think about it. But then when we did the exercise, it just happened effortlessly. It was like the brain was connected to the muscle. What we're going to do now is the one pose we shouldn't do. We're actually not going to do child's pose, but we're going to, feels like PT rather than yoga. What we start to do, Mike, is we start to integrate this in with the yoga practice. We start to find ways to bring this and weave these kind of exercises into our yoga practice. So then it actually starts to become more yoga. So what we're going to do now is we're going to do Apanasana, knees to chest pose, and hug them. And then we're going to repeat and see what it feels like. So this is dynamic Apanasana. This is passive. You just kind of hold it here for a moment. Take a couple of deep breaths. Very good. And then straighten the legs up. And then lift your right leg. And lift your left leg up. And then lift both legs up. So make sure that you guys, after this call, you know, go and activate your rectus femoris again. Make sure you do that little PT so you don't go out into the world with a compromised neuromuscular system. Did you guys feel the difference? Did you feel like after you stretched? So it's not like you lost strength per se, but that your brain got disconnected from the muscles all of a sudden because we are passively moving the body in those poses. The brain became disconnected from those muscles. So that's the number one yoga pose that you shouldn't do and why you shouldn't do it. And that was just like a little small example. You can imagine, doing a kind of a class, which you guys have done, where you do passive pose after passive pose after passive pose after passive pose. The one idea that I want to leave you guys with is that when we start to improve muscle function, we not only have stability, but we actually have improved range of motion. Our muscles, are able to work much more effectively. On my YouTube channel, I have this wonderful 2 or 3 different hamstring kind of practices. I highly suggest you check them out. And it kind of directly relates to this this kind of idea of what I'm trying to teach you guys in getting the quads. It's really, the secret is lying in the quads and getting the quads to activate properly. So yes, I don't actually teach, Billy. I don't really teach hip openers anymore. And let me show you another quick demonstration of something. I want you, and you're welcome to try this with me, but I'll just come back onto my yoga mat. Just give me 1 second. So if you think about, hip openers. So one of the hip openers that we do is sometimes called this runner's pose, this runner stretch, yeah? And when we do the runner stretch, we can go very deep into the pose. I'm not going to do it, but I'll sort of demonstrate it. So this pose, right? Yes, you know what I'm talking about? You pull this in. Okay, look at this. So this is my knee at 90 degrees. That's my range of motion. Okay, if I do the runner's pose, I can go like much further. If I grab my hands, I can go much further. So yeah, I'm not a big fan of it. What I would rather you do is to start working on getting your hip rotators activated. And then you're going to start feeling not only an improved range of motion, but you're also going to feel a lot more stable afterwards, because you're not going to be walking around with loosey-goosey hips. Now, loosey-goosey hips feels good, but it doesn't support the structure of your hips. And furthermore, it actually will then compromise the hips. I have a few friends that have had hip replacement surgery. I've had other friends that have had knee replacement surgery, and I've had friends that have had both. And guess what? They have very open hips, whatever that means. Their hips go like, and so you can have open hips, but you know what? Flexibility always leads to instability, hands down. And instability always leads to injury. So just because you have flexibility doesn't necessarily mean that, it's a good thing. If you look at gymnasts, you take a look at gymnasts like Simone Biles and, all of these other kind of gymnasts. And what do you see? And they're all these young people, but as you look at the starring lineup of these Olympic gymnasts, what is one thing that you see? All of them are wrapped up in ace bandages. They've got support around their back. They have knee braces. They have hip braces. They have tapes around their arms, tapes around their wrists. And why is that? Because of stress, trauma, and overuse, they have a compromised neuromuscular system. that's not supporting their body. And so what we want to do is start to reestablish that connection. And that's what I would like to encourage you guys to do in your yoga practice. Check out some of the videos that I have and start to put this stuff into play. What you guys want to do is really begin to slowly and gradually build up your force tolerance level. Your force tolerance level is that, you know, the stresses that life places on you, you know, the things that you have to do in your day-to-day life. So that way, when you like sneeze, you're not going to throw your back out. Or when you go and reach for that, you know, bag of sugar in the top shelf, that your neck isn't going to go out because it's just too much weight for you and your body wasn't ready for it. Those are the kind of stresses that I'm talking about, is those kind of day-to-day activities where one day you just throw your back out from a very, you know, simple exercise or task because you just weren't ready for it neuromuscularly. So that's great that you've eliminated pigeon. That pigeon is like one of the worst poses that you can do next to child's pose. Well, they're both up there. and I don't think you're really missing it. So does anybody have any questions before we end off for today? Does anybody want to ask me anything? Yeah, somebody who just mentioned, Mike, hyperflexion is such a common goal, a yoga goal, but it makes sense that flexion doesn't increase stability and strength of muscle fibers. Yeah, and that's just it. It's just like the same idea as the slinky. You know, we're constantly pulling that slinky apart, and it's going to have repercussions one day. You know, it's one of the reasons why I wrote this book, is because I really want to try and get this into more people's hands and teach people just some very simple knowledge about what muscles help us fold forward. Well, if those muscles that are getting us to fold forward are not working properly, other little muscles in the back start compensating, and that's never, you know, a good thing. So, anatomy professor. Mike, are you an anatomy professor? Nice. Well, I hope that some of what I'm saying is in sync. What about forward folds? Linda, can you be more specific in your question? Do you want to just unmute and jump in and ask?
Yeah, I was told, you know, you just forward fold, you forward down. It's more like touching the toes almost. It's just forward fold. I do that at my yoga classes.
Okay.
We do those. Is that bad or good?
So it just depends. It depends on a few things. One of the kind of suggestions that I often give is to start learning how to back off like 30%. So especially if you're a hypermobile person and you have a lot of flexibility already, flexibility meaning that it's not hard for you to touch your toes or maybe even put your foot behind your head, that start to like learn not to do those things. Like instead of trying to touch your toes, maybe just learn to come halfway. And so start to back off from that sort of part of the practice. I actually teach, you know, I teach that kind of like forward fold thing. There's one pose which I like personally. It's just a personal preference. Prasarita Padottanasana, wide leg, forward fold. And so oftentimes when I'm teaching people Uttanasana or Prasarita Padottanasana, wide leg forward fold, that I tell people, put your hands on your hips. Because as soon as you start to reach for the ground, the whole dynamic changes, right? As soon as you start to reach for the ground, the pose becomes more dynamic. So what I try to do is get people to just leave the hands on the hips. In Costa Rica Apanasana, there is actually an option, or there is in the series, I think it's the B, where you actually do leave the hands on the waist and you just come forward and you hold that. And it's a lot more dynamic. You're not so passive in that pose. And the same thing, Linda, with seated forward folds. With seated forward folds, instead of like having your hands there trying to reach for the feet,
Right.
bring the hands behind the back and fold forward. Now you're pure muscle. Now it's completely all muscle at that point, because nothing is going to push you except for your muscular contraction of your abdominal core. Does that make sense?
Makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. The tricky part is, like, if you're going to start holding these postures for a long time, and then you've got to make a decision. If you're holding it for a long time, which, you know, I'm a huge fan of holding postures because of the mental, you know, aspect in yoga. The question is, how do I hold it in a way where I'm not compromising my body, my neuromuscular stability, and I'm also holding it in a way that is not passive per se, but allows me to relax into the pose. So that's where props come into it, in my opinion. Like, I'm not going to leave my hands on the floor. I'm actually going to come up a bit, so that way I can create some extension in the spine, create some muscular engagement in my core, and keep lifting my pubic bone away from my thighs.
Okay.
So that's what I would do.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. It was a great question, by the way.
Thank you.
Really good question, because it's such a typical, you know, pose. And, you know, we talked about passive stretching. One of the ways that we passive stretch is with gravity, obviously. So anytime gravity is involved, we just need to kind of think about how to back off from it. We had another question here. With a knee replacement, it's difficult to kneel. Any recommendations? So, you know, first of all, God bless you, Lorraine, for your current, you know, dealing with your knee. What I would say to you is to start looking at, like, absolutely some of the muscles around the knee. Now, I don't know if, you know, it's a nice goal to start wanting to kneel. Let me back up 1 second. So if you're wanting to kneel, what we need to start thinking about is, what are the muscles contracting as you're kneeling? Well, there's a little bit of glute, little bit, and there's a lot of hamstring. And so the hamstrings are shortening, all 4 of them. So that's where I would start, is like, how do you get those hamstrings activated? I would love to get my hands on you and do a test, a before and after, and see what would happen. But I mean, that's what you want to start looking at. A lot of people, not everybody, but a lot of people get knee surgery, usually because something has become compromised within the knee, and that knee has become stressed out due to, you know, something that's been unstable. And so the knee has kind of taken a bit of a beating. So I would encourage you to start looking at getting the muscles surrounding the knee in a better place. Look at the hamstrings, look at the quads, especially the rectus femoris, and start getting those muscles activated. Also looking at the psoas. So,
May I ask a question?
sorry?
May I ask a question?
Absolutely. Who's speaking?
It's Lorraine.
Hi, Lorraine.
How are you doing?
Good.
Yeah, the surgeons have recommended never to kneel. So
Sorry?
that's, the surgeons have recommended never to kneel again.
Never to kneel. Well, I'm not going to, I don't know the whole story, and I don't know background. It might be, you know,
Yeah.
but what I can say is, like, you know, if you, whether or not you're going to kneel, to me, is besides the point. The real point is, you know, you want to make sure that you get those muscles working, you know, properly. And I can't tell you, and speaking from personal experience, because I've dealt with knee issues for 20 years. And because I like to hike a lot. And what I have found is that my hip flexors and glutes are one of the key factors in whether or not I'm going to have knee pain or not. So if my glutes aren't working and if my psoas isn't working properly, my knees are going to take the brunt of it. So the hip flexors and hip extensors, again, kind of like act as these shock absorbers. You know, whether you're a skier, a hiker, a walker, whatever you're doing, if those muscles aren't holding the bones properly, then it's just going to go down into the knees. And so I would just encourage you as much as possible, like start looking at getting, you know, and I'm not telling you to strengthen those muscles. I'm not saying, you know, go out and do a bunch of, you know, squats with weights, or what are those leg lifts, you know, on the machine.
Yes.
I'm telling you to do that. I'm telling you, you got to start reintegrating the brain to those muscles.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So thank you very much, everybody. And it's just so great to see everybody. Mike, I can't wait to see you as well on the 11th. We're going to be having our book launch, if you missed it, on October 20th. And the book launch is on October 21st. Please mark the calendar. We're going to be sending out a lot of reminders because we want this to be the biggest book virtual launch party. I'm going to have a special guest with me who's actually going to be interviewing me in this party. We're going to do about a 20-minute interview. I'm going to be sharing a little bit more about the book, a little bit more of an unveiling. So bring your champagne or your best cup of chai, and we're going to be celebrating the launch of Stop Stretching. So thank you guys so much. It's been an absolute honor to speak with you. And I look forward to seeing you again real soon. Namaste, everybody.